My lesson today is all about our very first revising strategy, which is focused on adding paragraphs. Now, before we can jump into that strategy, I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about the writing process. So you've probably been taught this before. Writers use a process to make sure that their writing is as good as it can be. So normally writing starts with some sort of pre-writing. That's where we brainstormed our ideas, where we thought about topics we could write about. That was all in the pre-writing stage. Then we did our writing. That's where we did some of our flash drafts, worked on really getting our ideas from our head onto the paper. Revising then is when you're going to really focus on what can you do to your writing to make it better. What could you add? What could you replace? What could you move around? Writers spend a lot of time in this revising strategy or revising step. They don't just write a piece of writing and say, I'm done, it's great. Because they know that they can always make their writing better. Editing then is one of the last steps. That's where you check all the tiny little things like spelling and grammar and punctuation. And then you publish your writing with your final draft. So a lot of times students have some confusion between revising and editing because they both have the same end goal. When you're revising or editing, you're focused on making your writing better, improving the quality of your writing. However, revising is where we're going to spend most of our time this week. So revising is all about those bigger changes. So adding details, rearranging parts of your story, replacing some words that maybe aren't so good with better words. And one other thing that we might focus on when we're revising is organizing our story into paragraphs. So that brings us to our mini lesson for today, which is about putting paragraphs in our narrative writing. So when I say those words, starting a new paragraph, I mean that you need to indent or press tab when typing. So perhaps you take a second and try to find the tab key on your keyboard. That's how you indent. I want you to know that writers start a new paragraph to help their reader better understand their writing. So right now I have two writing samples on my screen. You'll observe that one isn't organized in paragraphs. Some of your writing probably looks like this right now, and that's okay. Today, at the end of this lesson, hopefully you feel like you can go back in and make your writing or to be organized into paragraphs, just like this example over here. So you'll notice the one that is not in paragraphs is all one chunk, while the piece of writing that's organized into paragraphs is indented. It has these spaces prior to their paragraphs. And they achieved those by pressing the tab key on their keyboard. There are some times when you need to start a new paragraph. One time is when a new character is speaking. Whenever you have dialogue in your story, you'll always start with a new paragraph. You might also start a new paragraph when there's a new character, when a new character thinks something, when there's a new idea, when there's a new event, when there's a new setting. Hopefully you're catching on by this list right here that basically anytime anything new happens or is introduced, it's probably a good idea to start a new paragraph. Maybe you start a new paragraph just because the reader needs a break. You've just had a really long piece of text and you need to start a new paragraph. This next bullet point is one that really helps me in my writing. So think about a movie or a TV show. You know in movies and TV shows that the camera moves around a lot. One time you might be focused on one area of someone's house and then it switches to something else when something new is happening. My recommendation is to think about your story kind of like a movie. So every time the camera would change positions, it's a really good time for you to start a new paragraph. You might also start a new paragraph to just kind of change the tone or the emphasis. Maybe you just add it for like dramatic effect. And also when the time is moving, either forwards or backwards. Now, I know this is a long list that's on my screen right now. And here's my one takeaway for you. As long as you have paragraphs, as long as you've thought about how can I organize my writing into chunks, you're meeting expectations of narrative writing. There's no right way to paragraph your writing because it's really up to you as the writer. But these are definitely some considerations that you can think about as you're doing this work. So let's take a look at this example right now. You can see it's a little bit of a story. I'm wondering if you can think about how many paragraphs you currently see in this piece of writing. Feel free to pause the video right now, count the paragraphs, and then unpause. I see right now that there are 1, 2, 3, and 4 paragraphs. There are 4 paragraphs in just this small piece of text. And I was able to see that they are paragraphs because they're indented. I noticed one paragraph begins because there's some dialogue, and that's one of our rules. I noticed that it's kind of switching locations, and they've decided to start a new paragraph. So you can see that this piece of writing used some of those suggestions that I showed you on the last slide. I also want you to know that your writers in your books do this all the time. You probably haven't even noticed the paragraphs. Consider checking it out, opening up your choice book and looking at all of the paragraphs. So on my screen right now, I have a screenshot of a Harry Potter book. And you can see just on this first page, just on page 40, how many paragraphs the author put in to organize their writing. Paragraphs are really for the reader. They help the piece of writing to make more sense for the reader. So let's do a little bit of practice next by taking a look at my personal narrative. So here's my story so far, my story about that pufferfish. And you can see that I, as a writer, I did know that I needed to have paragraphs. So I already put some paragraphs in, especially here when I had some dialogue. I also just added some other paragraphs throughout here. But I'm going to think, as I look here, I notice all of my paragraphs so far are kind of the same length. And I think that's kind of boring. So I'm going to think about where could I add some additional paragraphs. So let's zoom in here on this portion. I'm going to be taking a look at this chunk right now that I currently have just as one paragraph. And I want to think about where is a spot that I could potentially divide this into more paragraphs. So it reads, I stepped into the water with my snorkeling goggles on. The snorkel tube was dangling by my chin. I waded deeper into the water. It felt chilly on my legs as I waded deeper in. As I looked down, I could see small fish zipping around me. I only snorkeled for the first time a few days ago. Ooh, time out. It seems like this first couple sentences are all really related. So I like how they flow next to one another. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this next part to its own paragraph because it seems like it transitions to some internal thinking. Okay. I only snorkeled for the first time a few days ago, but I was feeling a lot more confident about my snorkeling abilities today. However, I still plan to only go where I could touch the bottom if I absolutely needed to. I kept wading deeper and deeper. Ooh, okay. So here I have some internal thinking, and then I switch back to the story. So I'm going to once again move this to start a new paragraph. And I might just keep that all by itself, or maybe I choose to take some of this information and pull it up and move it to this paragraph. So you can see right now that when I first started this work, everything that was in yellow was smushed together. It was all one chunk of writing. I decided, though, to split it up to help make more sense to my reader. Now, one thing I noticed when I copied my flash draft from my slides, I noticed that it didn't indent at all. I don't see any of those nice little spaces that I saw in the models we were looking at. So what I need to do is I'll click before the first word or the first letter of all of my paragraphs and just press that tab button on my keyboard. And you'll see that now my paragraphs are indented. And it makes it really easy for my reader to see that I'm starting a new paragraph. Now, what I would continue to do is exactly what I just did in this text in the yellow. I'd like to keep going through my story just like that and seeing where might it make sense for me to add a new paragraph. Potentially keeping this list handy next to me as just a guide to help guide my work and my thinking. So sixth graders, my next suggestion for you is to have you go into your rough draft and add paragraph